differences also have created a lot of prejudice that really goes both ways, bad feelings between the two cultures. And so there's a sense in which the Mosquito people are looked down on. It's maybe not so different than what some of the Native American cultures sense here in our country. There would be some similarities, but when we go to the city and we talk to Hondurans and tell them we live in La Mosquitia, we often get a very interesting response. It's the place that they don't go. It's the people that they don't interact with. They're weird, they're superstitious, they're backwards, they're lazy. A lot of those kinds of comments that we hear. It's certainly not everyone, but it is a problem that they face. So that's kind of a big zoomed out picture. Now I'm going to take you way in to an individual just to try to give you a little bit of a balance and a little bit of an illustration of their life. This fellow is a friend of mine. He lives in our village. His name is Laston. He is a few years younger than me. He grew up in Nicaragua, which is only about 5 miles from where we are. We're very close to the border. And so we get a lot of people from Nicaragua. They come back and forth across the river. Laston grew up in Nicaragua in a town called La Esperanza. And as a young man, found a girlfriend up in our village. And so he moved there. And they have one little girl. And this is, on the left, is a couple of houses that he's lived in. The top picture was the house that he built when they first got together. And it's a very traditional Mosquito house. It's made of wood that's harvested there locally, mostly pine, sawn up locally in a thatch roof, and a dirt floor and an outside kitchen. So that's a pretty typical standard of living, I guess. The glow that you see in the background is not a sunset, that's a wildfire, which are common in our part of the world, especially during dry season, April. And this was, I think this was last year that I took this picture. There was a fire that had surrounded this house, which is kind of out on the edge of the village, and it was almost completely around, almost 180 degrees around this house. And they weren't home, they had gone away. And so everybody in town was sort of worried. And when the fires get that big, there's really nothing you can do. There are no pumps, there's no trucks, there's no, the best thing you have is buckets and, maybe some rakes or something to try to beat it out. So it can be a pretty precarious situation. And you can look at the building materials that house is made from, and you can pretty much figure how quickly that house would go into nothing if an ember landed on top of it. But you can also see to the right, there's a timber frame structure started, and that became this house in the lower picture, which is actually probably a more common style of houses. They often build their houses up on stilts. Traditionally, Mosquito people live along rivers and swamps where there's a lot of water, and so traditionally they build their houses up, even though that's not really the case in our village. That's just the way they build their houses. So up on stilts, 1 or 2 bedrooms with a separate kitchen building. This picture I took last year. One day, we went to his house for a Bible study, and I was the first one to get there, and he had just finished his house. It was brand new. And I climbed the stairs, and he's sitting there in his hammock on his front porch in the house that he built, and he worked hard. This man was dedicated. There's no Lowe's, and there's no hardware store, and there's really no money to buy the stuff that a store would have. And so he worked. He did some jobs for us. This is a picture on the right. He was working for me during that time. Working on a fence, moving a garden fence, and so he's sharpening my axe with a little small file to work on a stump. A lot of manual labor. That's the way of their life. They farm with machetes. That's the only farm equipment that they have. So they hack out of the jungle and they plant their rice with a stick, and then they harvest it and then put it in sacks, and that gets them through mostly till the next year. They raise rice and beans and plantains and bananas, a plant called yucca, or sometimes it's called cassava. That's a staple for them. That's mostly their diet. They don't really raise vegetables much. They don't get a lot of meat. They pretty much farm to live and live to farm. That's basically their life. The majority of them will never leave La Mosquitia. In fact, quite a few of them will never leave the village they were born in. There's really nowhere for them to go, and there's no way to get there. Where they want to go, they go by foot. They walk, or take a canoe on the river. in order to understand Mosquito culture, which sets the context for the ministry work that we do, of course, learning a different culture is a long prospect. It takes a long time to really understand the way people think. And we've lived there in this village for 3 years now, so in many ways, we're just starting to understand some things. And so, as I'm thinking through how to convey to you in a short amount of time, the critical pieces to help you understand what the context is, I thought of 3 things that we hear people say on a regular basis. And we all know that every culture has its sayings that people, the things that you say without even thinking about it. And oftentimes they pick up meaning that's kind of implied, implicit meaning that's not, because they're so common and everybody says it all the time. So I thought of 3 sayings that we hear around us in our community on a regular basis that I think kind of illustrate some of the mentality and the way of thinking that we are trying to fight against and help. The first one that we hear all the time is people will talk about how poor they are. And it is true that materially speaking, you could consider them poor. They don't have bank accounts, but they don't have a lot of money. They don't really keep money. They get a little bit of money and they hurry to spend it. And it's usually not much. They don't really have access to a lot of resources. Their government, their infrastructure is very poor. They don't really have schools. So there's a lot of ways in which, if you were to measure their material status, you could call them poor. But this saying reflects more than just, I don't have a lot of money right now. It's a mentality that says, I have nothing, I am nothing. Sometimes it's an excuse to not try. Right? Somos pobres. Often it's something that people will say when they come to my gate and they want me to give them something. They'll tell me how poor they are. And I'm not very inclined to give things away. We don't do a lot of that. We're very careful about how much we just give to people. But this is something that people will often say. We're poor. Somos pobres. Somos nada. Another thing we hear a lot is somos olvidados por el gobierno, por todo el mundo. The government doesn't care. Nobody really cares. We're at the end of the chain. We're at the bottom of the totem pole, and we're forgotten. And this is more than just a comment. This is a deep-seated belief about their identity. You talk to a mosquito person very long, and you'll discover that what they believe about who they are and their place in the world is that they are forgotten and abandoned. And again, there is some truth to support that, because the fact of the matter is that the government of Honduras is a country that has been generationally has been weighted with the burden of poverty. And so even the government doesn't have the resources it needs to do its job. And there are good people in government who try and just don't have what they need to do positive things. But there's also a lot of corruption. There's a lot of negative influences. And very often, La Mosquitia is the last part of the country to get whatever help. When foreign aid comes into the country, a big chunk of it goes into the politicians' pockets, and then a big chunk of it gets distributed to the politicians' favorite communities, and then a little bit of it gets distributed evenly. But there's usually, by the time that spreading around gets out to La Mosquitia, it's just a dry rag. There's nothing left. And so it's true. In many ways, they are forgotten. But the problem is, again, they internalize that and turn it into an identity. And they believe that they're forgotten because they're not worth remembering. And then ultimately they begin to project that onto God. Because if that's your belief about the world, if you believe that you're forgotten because you're not worth remembering, then you can't help but believe that God probably doesn't think of you much either. And so that's kind of you can start to see where there begins to be spiritual implications in these beliefs. A third thing that we hear, and this is one of those phrases that's just ubiquitous. What can we do? ¿Qué vamos a hacer? it means something similar to like we say, it is what it is. Can't do nothing about it. And there are a lot of times where it's healthy to have this approach. There are a lot of problems in life that we do well to not worry about and to not stress about. We can't do anything about it, so give it to the Lord and just rest. And that's a healthy thing. But there are also a lot of times when that question actually has an answer. There is something we can do about this. There is something that God has given us that we can make this situation better. And very often, this phrase is used as a way to excuse oneself from the responsibility of making things better. And again, there's spiritual implication here because there's a very strong sense of resignation in this statement, and very often that gets carried into spiritual walk. There's also this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but there's a very legalistic and works-based theology that permeates this culture. And so this kind of an attitude often gets carried into their spiritual and religious life, the sense that I've tried, and I really can't live up to the standard. I can't be good enough, so what's the use? That's sort of one of the ways that this attitude impacts their spiritual walk. So that's kind of a quick primer on Mosquito culture. I know it's really, really short, but I only have 40 minutes, so I have to budget my time. I want to talk to you just a little bit about our organization, who we are, and what we do, because I know many of you aren't really that familiar. So we work with Missionary Air Group, which is based in North Carolina, but we work in Central America. Missionary Air Group has as its mission to use airplanes as a means to deliver things like medical care and humanitarian aid and missionary teams and other kinds of useful and helpful things to people who live in places that are hard to get to, with the purpose of exemplifying the compassion of Christ. And with that compassion, building a bridge across which the knowledge of God and the gospel can travel. That's the model that we use. There is for us, there's a strong model in the ministry of Christ, who came to earth with the purpose of sealing the covenant of our salvation, right? His death and resurrection is the kingpin of his time on earth. But the method that he used, the model of his ministry, was to come and have compassion. He ministered to the poor and to the sick and to the needy, and he ate with the sinners, and he showed love and compassion as a means of bringing the light of God into the world. And so that's the model that we follow. We are not a church planting organization. That's not our main ministry. In fact, La Mosquitia is full of churches. They really don't need more churches. They need better churches. They need stronger churches. And so, but that's not our mission. Our mission is to show compassion, and through that compassion, draw people to the love of God. We in Honduras, we have basically 3 areas of operation, 3 ministry programs. We have an aeromedical program, which is medical flights, flying patients. We have the Roosters Hospital is really a clinic. It's called the Roosters Hospital for historical reasons, but in its current iteration, it's just a small clinic that's in our village that we operate. And then evangelism and training outreaches that we do in the communities around us. Those are kind of our 3 areas of operation. I'll give you a little bit more information on those. The aeromedical program is basically that we have the airplane, which is a tool to move people and supplies. La Mosquitia is a land, I mentioned that there aren't any roads that connect it to the rest of the country. It's also true that in a large part of La Mosquitia, there aren't any roads, period. There are a lot of communities that do not have a road that goes anywhere. And so your only means of travel is by a canoe or by an airplane. And for the majority of people who live in those communities, they have no money to hire an airplane. There are a couple of companies that do charter flights and things, but it's incredibly expensive to fly an airplane. And those people in many of those communities do not have the means to pay for that. And so if someone in your family has a medical emergency, the best you can hope for is hope they get better, I guess. We went to visit another community down along the coast, several hours from where we are, and a coworker and I went, and we had to ride on a little boat. It was about maybe 3.5 feet wide and probably 25 feet long, the outboard motor, and we cruised down the river and up the canals, and it was about a 6-hour boat ride back to this town of, I would say, probably 8,000 people. It's a pretty good-sized town. And we went into, there's a medical clinic there, a government health center, and we were talking to the doctor, and we said, so what do you do? They don't have an operating room or anything like that. What do you do when there's an emergency? And they said, well, if they're well enough, then we'll put them on the boat and send them to the hospital in Puerto Lempira. And that's a 6-hour boat ride on that little canoe that I was talking about. And so, well, what if they're not well enough? Well, then they wait here until they get well enough. There was no answer. There's nothing else to do. And so that's the condition that a lot of folks live in. And even that, the boat ride costs money, which is oftentimes money that they don't have. Even if it's just, that boat ride is probably $12 to $14, I would say. So to send the patient and a family member with them, for a lot of families, that's just out of reach. That's not feasible. So their ability to get to help is severely limited. And that gets them to the hospital in Puerto Lempira, which is a government hospital. Puerto Lempira is the regional capital kind of that area of Honduras, La Mosquitia. So even there, they're still isolated from the big city. And that hospital is severely underfunded and under-equipped. This little boy, his name is Marvin, and he lives in a community about an hour and a half north of where we live. And he was helping his dad, they're farmers, and his dad has some cattle. And so they were out rounding up cattle. And he, at 5 or 6 years old, was on horseback helping his dad round up cattle. Way too small to be doing that. And of course, he fell off his horse and broke his arm. And it was a bad enough break that he needed hardware to set the arm. He needed rods or whatever it was that they needed. Well, the hospital in Puerto Lempira doesn't ever have that kind of supplies, and so he needed to get into one of the cities. The problem is that the government hospitals in the cities, for emergency surgeries, you're going to wait 3 to 6 weeks. And so we had a case of an older lady with a broken femur who I think waited 4 or 5 weeks to get surgery to fix that broken leg. And so that's a real problem. And so some other folks on our team spend a good deal of time coordinating and communicating with doctors to try to find a hospital and a surgeon and the hardware, the supplies they needed, and because that is not all in one place. You have to find all of that stuff separately and try to bring it together. And she was successful. She found a way to get him into surgery, and we were able to fly him to the city, him and his dad. And he was able to get the surgery that he needed. And a few weeks later, we had an empty flight coming back, and so we were able to bring them home. And Marvin, his arm is now fine. He functions perfectly normally, and he's going to have a normal life, which is not necessarily guaranteed. I'm guessing that most of us here who have children have at one point dealt with broken bones. It's a normal thing for kids to have. I don't think any of us have ever thought this has the potential to ruin my child's life. We just don't think of it that way. It's an inconvenience. It's hard to see your kids in pain. It might be a little expensive, but we all have the confidence that it's going to be okay. It's just a broken arm. But that's not the case for these folks. I've seen people in the city begging for money with their arm dangling, swinging like a pendulum, or maybe around in circles like a lasso, because their arm broke and it never got fixed. And so now it just hangs, and it's completely useless. And it's tragic because it's such a simple thing. And so that's the kind of challenges that they face. It's really hard to understand the depth, how pervasive these kinds of problems are. Every step of the way, there's an obstacle or a challenge. There's no doctor, or there's no this, or there's no that, or it feels impossible sometimes. And so when you have no resources, it actually is impossible. So those are some of the kinds of problems that we're trying to help them with. We don't just use the airplane for medical patients. This picture on the top left is a group of pastors from North Carolina that come down several times a year and work in some of the Baptist churches up and down the river the Patuca River to the north of us, and so we fly them back and forth several times a year. They're training pastors and just strengthening those churches and trying to build up the communities there. And then there's also, occasionally, there's some emergency runs that we do to bring in critical supplies. This picture was taken after we had a big medical team, and it was a full week. We had 820 some patients in the week, and a full team of doctors and dentists, and everybody was tired. And so I flew the last team of doctors back to the city. And very often when we go to the city, if we're coming back relatively empty, we'll get a list from our wives of groceries to bring, because we don't have a grocery store in our village. There's nowhere to buy stuff, and so we'll get a list, and sometimes that list can get a little long. It's gotten a little bit better as we're doing more flying. We have more opportunities to bring stuff back. So this day, they said, we don't want to cook, just bring pizza. And so I went to a couple of pizza stores and brought home a stack of pizza. But there are oftentimes things that are actually critical. Equipment or medical supplies or food that because we're doing medical flights or other kinds of flights, we have opportunity to get in the city and bring back to our base, which is, like I said, it's a small village. There's no stores. The nearest grocery store is 4 hours away, off-roading, and that's a pretty basic store. And so in those cases, the airplane can meet a critical need. The Roosters Hospital is a facility that was built actually before we were there. We didn't build the facility, but we kind of reopened it about 15 years ago. It's a small clinic. We have one Honduran nurse that works full-time, and she takes care of usually very simple, basic health care. People come with colds and sniffles and cuts and, just basic stuff. But then several times a year, we'll bring in teams of doctors. Our biggest event is usually in February or March, and we'll have maybe 15 doctors and nurses and dentists and other people who come, and we'll have 700-800 patients that walk to be seen by a doctor. Some of them walk more than a day to get to us. For some of them, it is the only chance that they ever get to see a doctor, and many of them we treat a lot of parasites and a lot of skin, rashes and simple things like that. But every year there's a handful of patients who have something really serious that gets identified, and the doctor says, you need to go see somebody about this. And so then we try to follow up and arrange transportation for them to get to the city to see an oncologist or whatever the case may be. This is a doctor who's from our area, a Honduran doctor, who is holding a small child that has Down syndrome and also some neurological problem. And I wasn't there long enough to get the details, but he has some paralysis. His hands and feet are pretty much he's not able to control them. And so this doctor was trying to help this mother with some therapy ideas, some things she could do to take care of her son in her home, because she lives way up the river in a village way far away from everybody, and there's nothing there. There's nobody. And so she is the only caretaker that her son has. So the doctor was able to give her some tools to help care for her son. So that's a quick rundown of the Roosters Hospital. And then the training and evangelism looks like a lot of different things. We don't have, it's not always the same thing every time. Most of the churches in that area are pastored by people, or by local people from those communities who have very little education. The school system is pretty badly dysfunctional. And they don't really have a very solid biblical education, biblical foundation either. Their culture doesn't generally, they don't teach their children really much of anything in the home. They teach them how to work. They take them to the fields. As soon as they're big enough to hold on to a machete, they put them to work in the fields. And that's mostly their education that they get at home. They might get a couple years of school, maybe, if the teacher shows up. And so their education is very poor, and their biblical foundation is also very shaky. Most of their preaching comes from kind of repeating what they heard somebody say that sounded nice. And so, you can imagine how that can go badly. And so we feel very strongly that the way to reach the most people is to build up and equip pastors to teach the Word. Because if a culture of people can return to the Word of God, then God can give them what they need. Right? They don't need me to tell them how to live. If we as missionaries can get them to return to God's Word, then that will be the first biggest step in the right direction. And so our aim is to teach pastors to exposit the Word of God, to extract the meaning from the Bible. What does the Bible say? And teach that instead of just preaching things that sound nice. That's kind of the goal of our pastoral training. We've recently started doing a little bit more evangelistic outreaches into other communities. We're trying to be a little bit more intentional about that. One area in our village, just as an example, one thing that we've noticed in the last, since we've been there, is that the quality of their marriage and family, their concept of marriage and family is very, very, very poor. In fact, I think it's a stronghold, actually, that the enemy has on their culture, because they generally get together at a very young age, 13 to 15 years old, and their relationships tend to last about 5-6 years, and then they move on. That's not the exception, that's the rule, that's just the way that they do. So most of the kids are growing up in very mixed and jumbled families, and the quality of their family bonds are just not, it's very unbiblical, the concept that they have. Earlier this year, we were, after many, many obstacles and much difficulty, we were finally able to get our community together and have a marriage conference and sit down for a couple of days and just teach them, this is what the Bible says about what it means to be married. And there were things that we taught them that were basic concepts that they'd never heard before. And so it's a very needed type of teaching. It's an area that they need a lot of guidance in. So that's something that we hope to be able to continue to do. So that's a very, very brief summary of the kinds of things that we're doing in Honduras. All of those activities, especially the medical work, is it's a means to reach people in their point of need and show them compassion and give credibility to the message of the gospel. Because I don't think that, I think that you all probably feel the same way, that to show up in someone's life and just start preaching at them is not very effective. And so the work that we're doing is to bring the compassion of Christ, and through that compassion to draw them to the message of the gospel with the intent of drawing them to God and getting them to see the truth of Colossians 1:15 and 16, because that's the ultimate aim. Because Christ is, as the creator and Lord of their life, he made them, and he deserves the glory from their life, right? He deserves their worship and their praise. And so our hope is to turn them to him so that they too can live in the glory of Christ. I know I'm out of time. I don't want to go too far over, but I do want to just quickly summarize the work that we're doing in Roosters. There are two missionary families that live in that village. And with two families, there's a pretty small window of things that we can get accomplished in a year's time. We don't do it by ourselves. And so we need other people to be involved. And there's several ways that we ask for you to do that. The first thing and most important thing is to be in prayer with us. If you're a QR code user, this will take you to our newsletter sign up, our blog and newsletter, so that you can get email updates. We don't publish them very frequently, but we try to at least every few weeks to give a little bit of an update about things that are going on in ways that we need prayer. If you're not a QR code user, that's fine. We have a paper sign-up sheet, and I don't think we have it set out yet, but we'll look for a place at some point. We'll have a table with some newsletter sign-up and probably some prayer cards and some other things out back somewhere. So you can look for that after the service. Another way that Crosspoint has been involved in the past is with people. This is a couple of photos from the team that came down last year, and in April, I think it was. We had some concrete work that needed to be done, and then they ended up doing a whole bunch of other things as well. And so they were a tremendous blessing. We had a lot of fun together, and we really enjoyed having them there, and it was a great benefit for us. So people is another thing. These are the areas that we need help in. We really need, and I'm going to kind of hammer on the first one a little bit, we really need help with facilities and maintenance. And I've got a couple of projects early next year that I'm looking to put together some teams for. And so I would love to have some folks from here at Crosspoint come down and visit us for a time. We've got a learning center that we're wanting to build to address some of the, I opened with those three sayings that kind of define their paradigm about who they are. And that's what we want to challenge. We want to push against that. And so we need a place to be able to do that, to get people together and teach them the Word of God, teach them about marriage and family, teach them about their health, teach them about agriculture. There's so many things that we can do. We have some materials to start doing some work with the children because they don't really spend much time in school. We want to be able to get children together and work with them. And so we need a place to do that. And so we're looking in January, we're going to start that project. And I would like to have a couple of teams in January and February, and then maybe again in April and May, and then probably again in the summertime as well. So if you're interested in that, please let me know. We really could use that help. Also, on top of that, we have been praying for someone to come in a more long-term kind of capacity to work in maintenance as well. We have a number of buildings, several vehicles, generators, other equipment, and there's a lot of work in just keeping things up, and we don't really have enough people to do it. And so if there is someone that that has experience in especially construction and building maintenance, but also vehicles and equipment, I would like to have a maintenance manager on staff, would be ideal, permanent, long-term. But it even could be, we have some friends who are, they're Canadians, and they're retired, and so they're snowbirds. So when they leave Canada in the winter, instead of going to Arizona or Florida, they go to Honduras. And they spend 3 months in the winter every year at an orphanage there and do work for them. So something like that could work fine. But we really need some more consistent long-term help with facilities and maintenance. So if that's a need that you have an idea about, then I ask you to prayerfully consider that. Of course, we're an aviation and medical organization as well, and so those kinds of people, we can always find a place to plug them into.
The teams, 3, 6, or how many people?
Yeah, good question. So team size, the ideal team size is defined by how many people we can fit in the airplane, because that's how you get there. And so really 3 adults, or maybe 4 if they're not large, if they're not traveling with a lot of luggage, and weight is the limit. And so 3 to 4 adults is usually about the right size. So that means teams of either 3 to 4 or 6 to 7. We can do 1 or 2 flights to get people in. So that's kind of.
Could a single guy be the maintenance person?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, a young single guy would. I think that would be fine. Yeah. The difficulty, well, yeah, we won't, we can talk about details later. So people is a big need for us. And then, of course, as always, all of this requires financial resources to make it happen. Our family is supported. I mean, there's one fund that supports our family. There's a fund for medical flights, which is Honduras Aeromedical. It's very, very costly. When we fly a patient to the city and back, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,200 to $1,500 to do that round-trip flight. Sometimes we can do more than one patient at a time, but it's very costly. The hospital, all of the medical care that we provide at the Roosters Hospital is free of charge. And so people come, they're seen by a doctor, they sometimes receive medicine, and so all of that is covered by donations. And then the Learning Center is the construction project that I mentioned earlier that we're hoping to get started next year, do at least phase 1 next year, and then we have future plans for that as well. So those are 4 areas that are needs that we have, financial needs that we have. I'll just be candid with you and say that our family's personal support has been very consistent. The Lord has blessed us with a fantastic, consistent, faithful support team, and some of you are part of that, and so thank you for that. We have maintained very evenly what the amount of support that we have balanced with the living expenses that we have, and so it is an ongoing thing because life. Every month there's groceries to buy and all of those kinds of things. But that I don't put it up there because it's a desperate need for us. It's something that's ongoing, but it's something that has been pretty well provided for pretty consistently. Honduras Aeromedical is the flights, Roosters Hospital. Those two things are both also ongoing monthly expenses that we have in the mission as program cost, operational cost, and then the Learning Center is a special project that we're trying to raise some funds for as well. All right, I promise I'm almost done. I want to go back again to the beginning. And we asked the question, why? Why does this matter? And I know all of you have you hear all kinds of ministry things that are happening all over the world, and many good things that people are doing. And sometimes it can be a little hard to figure out what's the end, what's the goal, what is this for? What's really the end goal? I'll admit that for me, sometimes it's hard for me to see the forest for the trees because we're there and we've got things going on and there's people all around us, and sometimes I myself lose track of what are we even here for? What is this even? What are we aiming for here? Because there's lots of ways to get distracted and pulled aside. So I go back to the verse that we saw in the beginning from Colossians 1. If Christ is Lord and Christ is King, if that's really true, and if it's true for everybody everywhere, and if it's true for my neighbors in Roos, then what am I doing so that the kingship and lordship of Christ is more evident in their life? And I think that really boils it down better than anything else I can say. And so I guess in summary, to close, the thing that I want them to know is, firstly, that they're not poor. For one thing, there's a lot of things that they have. They have a very strong sense of community and helping each other. They have a very strong work ethic. They have all kinds of natural resources, soil to grow things. They've got things available to them. But more importantly, that's not really how we want to measure their wealth, right? Their material things isn't really where it matters. And so if you look at the things that God has given them, the ways that God has blessed their culture and their community, they're not poor. And I want them to know that. More importantly, I want them to know that they're not forgotten. And one of the ways that we demonstrate that is when people like you all here get involved and help them. It's an incredible gift to them to receive help from somebody that doesn't even know them. This picture on the right is a picture of my wife handing out clothing that is made from dresses of my grandmother who passed away about 1.5 years ago. And a friend of hers took all of her dresses and sewed them into skirts and made clothing and sent them to us. And we got to hand them out. And these are fabrics that I recognize. I remember my grandma. Oh, I remember that dress. That was really special for me. There's also a picture of Christmas gifts being handed out. Some of you have participated in that project that we do at Christmas time. And so these are ways that we demonstrate to them that your life matters and you're not forgotten. You're not forgotten by us. You're not forgotten by the church. Most importantly, you're not forgotten by God. And when they say, ¿Qué vamos a hacer? What can we do? There's nothing we can do about it. What I want them to know is that they're not helpless. These are all pictures of people praying. And this is what I want our community to know most of all, is that their needs can be met if they turn to the Lord. That's the answer to their problems. Turn to the Lord. And so as we live our daily life in Roos, and as we minister there, and as we attempt to help people and wade through the deep, deep waters of all of the need that is there, our hope and our goal is to show them that they're not poor, that they're not forgotten, and that they're not helpless, and help them to turn to the Lord and find in Him the joy and the blessing of all that He's promised. So thank you to all of you for your part in making that possible. for being part of sending us to do that work, and also for coming alongside and helping us along the way. Your support is absolutely critical to the work that we're doing there, and so thank you very much, and we're very thrilled to be back and see all your faces again, and look forward to spending a little time with you today. God bless you very much.